3 days before the bank was scheduled to seize his land, poor farmer Samuel Whitaker watched in stunned silence as a convoy of trucks rolled onto his dying farm, carrying 150 brand-new Case IH tractors, machines worth millions of dollars. And the most unbelievable part was that they had been sent by someone Samuel barely remembered helping decades earlier. But on the quiet morning when everything began, Samuel had no idea that miracle was coming. All he knew was that his life's work was about to disappear. It was April 3rd, 2024, and at exactly 6:12 in the morning, Samuel Whitaker sat alone on the splintered wooden porch of his farmhouse outside Millbrook, Kansas, staring down at the foreclosure notice folded in his trembling hands. He had already read the letter at least 50 times since it arrived, yet somehow the words still felt unreal every time his eyes moved across them. Final notice. Property seizure scheduled in 12 days. Samuel was 65 years old, and he had spent every one of those years working the same 180 acres of farmland that had belonged to his father and grandfather before him. The Whitaker farm had survived droughts, floods, market crashes, and 2 generations of economic hardship. But now it was about to disappear because of something far more ordinary: debt. Over the past 4 years, the costs of fertilizer, fuel, and repairs had climbed faster than Samuel could keep up with. And after 2 terrible harvest seasons and a broken irrigation system he couldn't afford to fix, the numbers simply stopped working. He had sold equipment, borrowed from neighbors, even taken a second mortgage against the land just to survive one more planting season. But the bank had finally run out of patience. The coffee mug sitting beside him had gone cold long ago, yet Samuel kept taking slow sips anyway, more out of habit than thirst. The farmhouse around him was quiet except for the faint creaking of old wood and the distant sound of wind brushing across empty fields that should have been filled with growing crops. His tractor, a rusting relic nearly 30 years old, sat motionless beside the equipment shed, looking as tired as the man who owned it. Samuel leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and stared out across the land that had defined his entire life. Every fence post, every stretch of soil, every crooked line of trees held a memory. Long summer days working beside his father, early mornings hauling grain before sunrise, the laughter of neighbors during harvest seasons that felt like celebrations. Now all of it would soon belong to someone else, probably a corporation that would bulldoze the farmhouse and merge the land into some massive industrial operation. Samuel let out a slow breath and rubbed his weathered hands together, trying to ignore the dull ache in his chest that had become constant since the foreclosure notice arrived. 12 days, he muttered quietly to himself. After 65 years, 12 days. For a long moment, he just sat there listening to the silence of the farm he was about to lose. Then something unusual disturbed that silence. At first it was so faint Samuel thought he imagined it. A low vibration somewhere in the distance, barely noticeable beneath the wind. He tilted his head slightly, listening. The sound came again. A diesel engine. Then another. Within seconds the quiet countryside began filling with the unmistakable rumble of heavy trucks traveling along the county road that ran past his property. Samuel frowned. Large trucks almost never came this way unless they were delivering seed or equipment, and even then it was usually 1 or 2 vehicles at most. But this was different. The rumble didn't fade like a single truck passing by. It grew louder. Much louder. Curious, Samuel slowly pushed himself up from the porch chair and stepped toward the railing, his stiff knees protesting with every movement. Dust began rising above the distant tree line where the gravel road curved toward his property. The rumbling engines multiplied until it sounded less like traffic and more like an approaching convoy. Samuel squinted into the pale morning sunlight just as the first vehicle appeared around the bend. It was a large semi-truck hauling a flatbed trailer, the kind used to transport heavy machinery. The truck slowed as it approached the entrance to Samuel's long gravel driveway, and then, to his confusion, turned directly onto it. Samuel blinked in surprise. "That's odd," he murmured. The truck rolled slowly toward the farmhouse, tires crunching loudly against the gravel. But before Samuel could even process what he was seeing, a second semi-truck appeared behind the first one. Then a third. Then a fourth. Within moments, a seemingly endless line of massive transport trucks began turning into his driveway one after another like a mechanical parade. Samuel stepped off the porch entirely now, staring in disbelief as the convoy continued to grow. The trucks stretched far beyond the property entrance, all the way down the road and out of sight around the curve. Each one carried a massive object secured to its trailer and wrapped tightly in protective white covering. Samuel walked several steps closer to the driveway, shielding his eyes with his hand as the rising sun reflected off the plastic coverings. "What in the world?" he whispered. The first truck came to a stop in the wide dirt clearing beside his barn. Its engine shut off with a loud hiss of air brakes. The driver climbed down from the cab without saying a word and began unfastening the heavy straps securing the cargo. More trucks continued pulling in behind it, parking carefully in long rows across the empty field where Samuel had planned to plant corn before the bank stopped approving his loans. Within 10 minutes, the quiet Whitaker farm looked more like a construction site than a struggling homestead. Drivers climbed down from their vehicles and began removing the protective coverings from the enormous machines strapped to their trailers. Samuel stood frozen as the first white sheet fell away. Beneath it gleamed a brand new Case IH tractor, painted a deep glossy red that practically glowed in the early sunlight. Another tarp came off the next trailer. Another identical tractor. Then another. And another. Samuel's mouth slowly fell open as realization crept into his mind. These trucks weren't lost. They weren't passing through. They had come here deliberately. By the time the last truck finished parking, the field beside Samuel's barn was filled with row after row of brand new Case IH tractors, more than he had ever seen gathered in one place in his entire life. Samuel tried counting them once, then stopped halfway through because the number seemed impossible. He stood there speechless as engines ticked quietly and drivers moved around the equipment like they were following some carefully planned operation. And just when Samuel thought the morning couldn't become any stranger, a black pickup truck slowly turned into the driveway and rolled toward him through the line of parked semis, carrying the one person who was about to explain why 150 tractors had just arrived at the poorest farmer in Millbrook, all because of a small act of kindness Samuel barely remembered from 25 years ago. Samuel Whitaker stood frozen beside his gravel driveway as the engines of the transport trucks rumbled across his field, still struggling to understand why dozens of brand new red tractors were being unloaded onto land that the bank was preparing to seize in less than 2 weeks. And just as the confusion began turning into frustration, the black pickup truck that had followed the convoy slowly pulled up in front of him. The driver's door opened and a man in his early 40s stepped out, dressed in work boots, dark jeans, and a brown jacket that suggested he was comfortable around farms and machinery. The man walked towards Samuel calmly, offering a polite smile before extending his hand. "Mr. Whitaker?" he asked. Samuel nodded cautiously and shook his hand. "That's me." The man introduced himself. "My name is Daniel Alvarez." Samuel studied his face but couldn't place it. "I'm sorry," he admitted, "but I don't think we've met." Daniel chuckled softly as if he had expected that answer. "Not recently," he said. "The last time we met was about 25 years ago." Samuel frowned slightly, glancing past Daniel toward the long rows of tractors shining in the morning sun. "Well," he said slowly, "I hope you can explain why all these trucks just drove onto my property." Daniel nodded and looked out across the field for a moment before speaking again. "About 25 years ago," he began, "a young man was standing beside Highway 41 outside Millbrook during a terrible winter storm. He'd been traveling for days trying to find work after his car broke down, and he didn't have any money left." Samuel listened quietly, unsure where the story was going. "Cars passed him for hours," Daniel continued, "until finally one farmer in an old blue pickup truck stopped and offered him a ride." Samuel's expression changed slightly as the memory began to surface. Daniel kept talking. "That farmer didn't just give the young man a ride. He brought him back to his farm, gave him a hot meal, and let him sleep in the barn loft until the storm ended." Samuel's eyes narrowed as the realization slowly formed. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small photograph, handing it to Samuel. The picture showed a skinny young man standing beside a much younger Samuel Whitaker in his old pickup truck. Samuel stared at it for a few seconds before looking up in shock. "That was you?" he asked. Daniel nodded. "Yes, sir." Samuel let out a quiet laugh of disbelief. "You were barely more than a kid." 20 years old, Daniel replied. Samuel shook his head slowly. "I remember that winter now. You were trying to get south to find work." Daniel smiled. That's right. And before I left, you even gave me a little money for a bus ticket. Samuel shrugged lightly. It wasn't much. Daniel's voice grew more serious. But it meant everything to me. Samuel glanced across the massive line of tractors filling his field. So, I'm guessing your life turned out all right after that. Daniel nodded. After I left here, I found a job at a farm equipment repair shop in Texas. I learned everything I could about tractors and agricultural machines. Eventually, I opened my own repair shop, then a dealership, and over the years the business kept growing. He paused briefly before continuing. Today, I run one of the largest agricultural equipment distribution companies in this region. Samuel whistled quietly under his breath. Well, I'll be. For a moment, they both stood there while drivers continued unloading machinery in the background. Finally, Samuel crossed his arms and asked the obvious question. All right, Daniel. That's quite a story, but what exactly does it have to do with my farm? Daniel walked back to his pickup truck, grabbed a thick folder from the passenger seat, and returned to Samuel. He handed it over carefully. Because, Daniel said with a small smile, 25 years ago you helped a stranger who had nothing, and I promised myself that if I ever had the chance, I'd return that kindness. Samuel opened the folder slowly, unaware that the papers inside were about to reveal how those 150 tractors had come to change the future of his struggling farm forever. Samuel Whitaker looked down at the documents inside the folder with shaking hands as the sound of tractors being unloaded continued across his field, and the more he read, the harder it became to believe that what was happening was real. The first papers showed ownership transfers, equipment agreements, and financial statements, but it was the final document that made Samuel stop breathing for a moment. It was a letter from the bank that held the mortgage on his farm. Slowly, Samuel lifted his eyes toward Daniel. What is this? He asked quietly. Daniel kept his voice calm. 2 weeks ago, I contacted your bank. Samuel stared at him. Daniel continued. I bought the loan they had on your farm. For a second, Samuel couldn't say anything. His mind struggled to process the words. You bought my loan, he repeated. Daniel nodded. And yesterday morning, I paid the entire balance. Samuel's shoulders sagged as the meaning finally settled in. You're telling me the farm is mine again? Daniel smiled. Free and clear. The old farmer looked out across the land he thought he was about to lose forever. Rows of bright red tractors now filled the field, their engines humming softly as drivers prepared them for work. Samuel wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, not even trying to hide the emotion. Son, he said slowly, I helped a lot of folks pass through this county over the years, but I never expected anything like this. Daniel shrugged gently. Most people forget small kindnesses. I didn't. He gestured toward the tractors. My company runs a program to help struggling farmers rebuild their operations. When I heard about what was happening to your land, I knew exactly where the first fleet should go. Samuel looked back at him in disbelief. You brought all this just for me? Daniel shook his head. Not just for you. For the farm. For the legacy your family built. The driver started several of the tractors, and the deep rumble of powerful engines spread across the Whitaker land for the first time in years. Daniel explained that his company's team would help Samuel plant and harvest the next season, giving the farm a chance to become profitable again. Samuel stood quietly watching the machines move across the soil that had been in his family for generations. For weeks he had believed he would lose everything. Yet now the same fields were suddenly full of opportunity again. After a moment, Samuel turned back to Daniel. You know, he said with a small smile, that night during the storm, I almost didn't stop. Daniel laughed softly. I'm really glad you did. The two men stood side by side as the sun climbed higher over the horizon, watching the powerful tractors roll across the land. What had once seemed like a simple act of kindness, a ride offered to a freezing stranger on a snowy highway, had traveled through 25 years of life before finally returning to the place where it began. And on that quiet Kansas morning, the Whitaker farm was given a second chance, all because one farmer chose to help someone who needed it.